As one is one is one, inside yourself or your father, all is none, all is none, all is one. It's time to call time from behind you. The illusion has been just a dream. The valley of death and I'll find you.
Welcome to Spooky Ass Shit. I am your host, Eric Dwinells, and this is part 5 of our Manson Family coverage. Part 5, which I thought might be the last part, but guess what? Looking at the notes I've got in front of me, I'm thinking we're going to get at least one more episode after this, because we have to do the follow-up, and I don't think we're going to get to that tonight. But what are we going to get to? We are going to get to and through the trial. Now, I said before, I don't want to say too much about the trial because there's already been books, most notably, of course, Vincent Bugliosi's Helter Skelter, and at least two movies made based on that book alone, not to mention other books and all that kind of stuff. But there are some aspects of the trial that I think you don't hear too much about. So, of course, I want to give you the facts that you need to understand the kind of conclusion to the story, although, as I said, there is a little bit more to the story after the fact. But there's also some incidents and some things that you are kind of brushed over by Bugliosi and some of the other folks that have covered it. So I just want to give those little moments their due and make sure that you guys are getting something hopefully fresh from all this Manson coverage. And of course, as always, before we begin, I want to point you to the show's website. That is spookyas.com or spookyasshit.com. They both take you to the same place, and that is the show's blog page. From there, you can listen to each and every episode, including the ones no longer available on your favorite streaming services. And you can also find merchandise. We have t-shirts and stickers and tote bags for sale, so if you're a true blue spookaroo, you're going to want to grab that. You can also find links to all of our social media. We are at Spooky Ass Shit on both Twitter and Instagram, and you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. And while you're there, don't forget to join our secret closed group, the Spookaroos. That's for those of you who really want to start talking about things, and things that maybe you don't want all your friends and family to see you talking about too much. Also, as we are getting ready to wrap up our Manson series, I am offering a little prize of sorts. If you follow us on Instagram, I will be posting a little contest sometime within the week being this Friday, August 30th, till next Friday, August 6th. And I will post a little contest asking you to comment on a picture that I post, and I will pick a winner, and you can have a chance to win the script, and I put that in quotations because it's really just some quotes that I put in a binder. It's not exactly a script, but the script that we used when recording this series, signed by most of the actors who appear in this series. So, look, none of us are superstars exactly, but who knows? Maybe someday these people will be very famous actors, or maybe this podcast will become very famous, and then you'll be able to say you have the script that we used and our autographs. So if you're interested in that, make sure you're following us on Instagram, and when I post the contest, you'll know all about it. All right, when last we left Charlie Manson and the family, he had been arrested for the Tate LaBianca murders, and he was charged. We'll get to whether he enters a plea and all that kind of thing in just a moment. But some important things to know, of course, Tex Watson is hiding out in Texas, and he's been found, and he's even been charged, but he's fighting extradition to California. He does not want to stand trial with Charlie and the girls. Charlie very much originally wanted him to stand trial, but for reasons we'll get into later, he's not as pushy about Tex being on trial with them in the same way that he is with the ladies of the group. He very much wants the ladies to face trial in the same trial that Charles himself is facing, and there's a reason for this. Now, before the trial begins, Aaron Stovitz and Vincent Bugliosi, who are the prosecutors from the DA's office, they are debating exactly how they are going to approach the motive for the murder. Now, in a murder trial, you don't have to prove a motive, but you just have to prove that the defendants did it. You'd have to prove that the evidence suggests that they did it beyond a reasonable doubt. You don't need to get into why they did it necessarily. However, if you're saying that somebody murdered somebody else, it usually helps to explain why they might have done it. It helps the jury understand why they might have done it, and then gives them a reason to think, yeah, these people probably did do it. And so motive usually is brought up. But Aaron Stovitz and Vincent Bugliosi were not on the same page about what they should tackle as the motive for these Helter Skelter murders. In fact, Aaron Stovitz didn't want to bring up Helter Skelter much at all. That is the name that Bugliosi uses, and he would say the family also uses, for the race war that Charles Manson wants to start. Bugliosi wants to use this Helter Skelter theory, saying that Charlie wants to start a race war between the blacks and the whites so that there will be a war breaking out between black people and white people. Black people will eventually win, and Charles Manson and his family during this time will be living in a magical cave underground for several years when they will emerge and take over from the black people who were too incompetent to run the country or the world on their own, and Charles Manson and his family would be the official rulers of the world from that point on. Aaron Stovitz says, Bugliosi, this is crazy, and no jury in the world is going to believe this, so let's just go with the regular old drug and robbery theory. And that's why these crimes were committed. But Bugliosi points out that there were no drugs found at the LaBianca residence, and that there was really no robbery either. Yeah, the family took, $72 from Abigail Folger, and they took a carton of milk from the LaBiancas and possibly a small bag of coins. But they left a bigger portion of Leno's coin collection in place, and they didn't take any money from the house at all. So robbery doesn't really seem like a good motive when the victims are overkilled and butchered in such a way that they were. He said, yes, I understand that Helter Skelter sounds crazy, but these are crazy crimes. And if you put yourself in the mindset of Charles Manson and his family, it starts to make more sense. That's why we need to call in these witnesses who can explain that these are not just things that the prosecution is making up. These are real things that Charlie was constantly talking about, preaching about, and trying to get people to believe in. The question comes up a lot, whether the prosecution actually even believed in this Helter Skelter theory. And the answer that some of them give, Bugliosi, of course, always claimed that he did, but he tends to have a vested interest in it, right? Because he wrote these books and made movies based on it, and he became a celebrity. As I said in an earlier episode, he kind of became America's DA, and even during the OJ case, they were still asking his opinion on things. And this is, almost 30 years later. Now, he may or may not have actually believed in it, but we know for a fact that some people in the DA's office didn't believe in the theory, but they did believe they could, quote, sell it to a jury. So they believed that a jury could be led to believe that this was true. Again, we have a story full of unreliable narrators. Now, during this time, they're not the only ones working on a plan. Charles Manson himself is formulating his own plan. He insists on being his own lawyer, which is a right guaranteed to citizens of America. The judge advises him against it, telling him he's making a fatal and tragic mistake. But he says, look, it's your constitutional right. If you want to act as your own lawyer, go ahead. And you all know the saying, a man who acts as his own attorney has a fool for a client. Well, by March, he proved himself so incompetent that the judge orders him to use a public defender instead. Manson himself was not too pleased with that. So forced to choose a lawyer, he had no problems trying to find a lawyer because a lot of public defenders offered to assist Charlie. This was a make-or-break case for anyone involved with it, and it could lead to bigger cases in the future and some notoriety, so a lot of people were very interested in taking this case. But Charlie, even though he had his choice of lawyers, he chooses a young lawyer who'd never even tried a criminal case before, a man by the name of Ronald Hughes. Now, why did he choose Ronald Hughes? Well, depends on who you ask, but it seems likely that he chose him because Ronald Hughes was so inexperienced and kind of a pushover. Maybe Manson felt that Hughes would be really more of a figurehead attorney, and Manson would still kind of get to call his own shots. But whatever the case may be, a few days later, Charlie asked for a different lawyer, a man by the name of Irving Kanarek. Now, Kanarek was notorious for his own outrageous courtroom antics and stall tactics. He was known for making objection after objection and causing trials to take much, much longer than was necessary. And this was exactly what Charlie wanted. A lawyer almost as unpredictable as himself. A loose cannon. Hughes himself was moved down the bench to become the attorney for Leslie Van Houten. Manson insisted that he and the girls be tried together. Now we can only speculate, but the reason for this was probably to prevent them from being examined by psychiatrists who would insist that the girls were brainwashed by Manson and did not act in their own interest but in Manson's interest. Manson's defense would be that he had no clue the murders were going to take place and that they were committed by the women at Tex's command, not his own. And that is the reason why he didn't really care if Tex Watson stood trial with them, because this way they could kind of pin it all on Tex and he wasn't there to say yay or nay. In January of 1970, Manson makes some unreasonable demands in court. This is just the first time he's starting to do this. He refuses to enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty, and the judge says that no answer will result in a plea of not guilty, so the trial will commence. On February 6th, Manson is interviewed by Rolling Stone. He goes off on his usual sermons about God and the devil, good and evil, and people being all one, life and death are all the same, black and white people are going to have a race war. He talks about the Beatles and the Bible, although he doesn't exactly lay out the whole Helter Skelter scenario. He tells the writers to go ahead and visit the family at Spahn Ranch. They'll see that they are just loving people, you know? So the writers do go and visit the people at the ranch, but they don't find the fun-loving free spirits that Charlie claimed would be there to greet them. Instead, they find people asking for money for, quote, the good stories, and the family was just talking about all the TV and book deals that they hoped to get once the trial was over. They asked the writers to put them in touch with the Beatles so that they could finally come and see Charlie. On February 24th, Patricia Krenwinkel has been in jail in Alabama, her home state, but at Charlie's request, as sent through Sandy and Squeaky, she stops fighting extradition and returns to L.A. to stand trial with Charlie, Leslie, and Susan. Meanwhile, Bugliosi interviews former family members Brooks Poston and Little Paul Watkins. You might remember them. They're the ones that Charlie sent out to Barker Ranch to kind of hold fort down there while he was getting the family to move out there full time. And then they ran into a guy named Paul Crockett, and he was kind of an older guru of his own, and he was into Scientology and had kind of heard, you know, about Charlie, and they talked about Charlie, and this guy Crockett was like, well, I mean, a lot of these things that this guy Manson is saying, these are just Eastern philosophy and Scientology and Dale Carnegie. This is nothing new. It's not like some groundbreaking thing, and it sounds like he's kind of using you guys. And eventually Little Paul and Brooks, they left the family to join this guy Crockett. So they were still looking for a father figure, but I guess they gave up on Manson. Now, Bugliosi found Watkins to be especially helpful since he'd been a long-time family member, and when they talked with him, he corroborated much of what Danny DiCarlo had said about the Beatles and the Bible and, you know, Helter Skelter and all that kind of thing. Now, on March 10th, we already talked about this in the last episode, but this is when Susan recants her testimony, saying that she'd been pressured into making up every word she'd said by the DA's office. When this happens, the prosecution and the DA's office immediately offer an immunity deal to Linda Kasabian in exchange for her testimony, which is really what they wanted anyway, once they realized that Linda existed and hadn't actually been involved in the actual physical act of murder. She wasn't, she didn't stab anybody, she didn't hold anybody down, she just kind of drove the car and wasn't even on location as the second night of murders were actually happening. She did drive them there, but anyway, she's less guilty than everybody else involved in the story. So they were happy to offer their deal to her as opposed to Susan Atkins, who, it turns out, wasn't as guilty as Tex Watson, but at the time she had been bragging and making up stories, kind of. She'd been talking about drinking blood and tasting Sharon Tate's blood and all these things that she wanted to do with the baby in an effort to make herself sound even more ghoulish, I guess you could say, more evil. She was trying to seem tough to her fellow prison inmates and I think to the world in general. She wanted to put on this show of like, look at me, I'm this crazy, tough, badass chick. But unfortunately for her, nobody felt that way. They were just like, oh, man. Around this time, Bobby Beausoleil, he goes on his second trial for murder. I honestly can't remember if I mentioned it in the last episode or not, but it ended in a hung jury, the first trial. So he's put on trial again. Now, Mary Brunner takes a deal to testify that she'd seen Bobby kill Hinman in exchange for her own total immunity, meaning she couldn't be found criminally responsible for any aspect of the murder and wouldn't face justice in any way. Bobby was sure that she had done this on Charlie's orders. And as payback, Bobby took the stand saying that Manson had been the one who actually killed Gary Hinman and that he'd just been a witness. This wasn't true, of course, but it is true that Manson probably was the one who directed Bobby to kill Hinman. The jury didn't buy Bobby's story, and he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Charlie, Susan, and Bruce Davis were all indicted as co-conspirators in Hinman's murder, and they would face their own charges for this later on. We're not going to get too much into that. As far as Mary Brunner goes, when the trial was over, she recanted her testimony and said that she had also made it all up under pressure from the DA, and the DA thought of trying to take back her immunity deal, but the judge said that would not be possible because the immunity deal was offered for her testimony in the trial. She had given her testimony in the trial. The fact that she was recanting it now, after the man had already been convicted, made no difference. Bobby could try and say, look, she recanted her testimony, I demand a retrial, but that would be a problem for the future, and they cross that bridge when they get to it. It ended up being a non-issue. Bobby Beausoleil is still in jail to this day. In early June, Charlie appeals for a change of venue, and the judge refuses. Charlie stands and turns his back on the judge, and for this insubordination, he is taken out of the court. The girls in turn stand up and turn their back on the judge as well. They are also taken out of court. And the next day, more motions are to be filed and everyone is back in the courtroom. The judge explains to Charlie and the girls that their antics might turn the jury against them. Manson responds,
"You leave me nothing. You may as well kill me now."
He then stretches out his arms and lowers his head as if he is hanging from a cross in a Christ-like pose. And the girls cry,
"This trial is the second crucifixion of Christ,"
and strike the same pose. Early that summer, the Rolling Stone article on Charlie and the family comes out, and Charlie is surprised to find that the general tone of the article is negative. It describes the family at Spahn Ranch as the Village of the Damned, referring to a movie from the 50s. If you have not seen The Village of the Damned, it's about an alien parasite that impregnates the women of a certain town. They give birth to these children all on the same day, and the children have these supernatural powers and no human feelings. And they're not afraid to murder. Charlie finds out through this way that although he is famous now, or should we say infamous, fame isn't all it's cracked up to be. Now, the prosecution has a big problem as we're heading into the actual trial. How can you convict Manson if he wasn't actually on hand to kill anyone? The answer is conspiracy. Under something called the vicarious liability rule, anyone involved in a conspiracy is criminally responsible for all crimes committed to further the objective of that conspiracy, even if the conspirator in question was not present when the crime was committed. Helter Skelter was the conspiracy, and the race war was the objective of that conspiracy. The crimes were committed to further that objective. And Manson, they said, was the mastermind. So, on Friday, July 24th, 1970, the trial begins. Charlie enters the courtroom on day 1 with an X carved into his forehead. Outside the courthouse, family members hand out flyers that contain this statement from Charlie.
You have created the monster. I am not of you, from you. I have X'd myself from your world. No man or lawyer is speaking for me. I speak for myself. I'm not allowed to use words, so I have spoken with the mark I will be wearing on my forehead.
It was the first in what would be a very long series of courtroom antics. At the end of the day, bailiffs reported that Charlie had offered them each $100,000 to let him escape. They also stated that the girls had offered sex in exchange for their own freedom. What was odd was that they made these offers openly and publicly, in full hearing of others. It seemed to be done as part of the show. This idea was correct. Charlie had instructed the girls to make these offers. Each day before they were walked into the courtroom, Manson and the girls were held in a small room next to the actual courtroom. This room contained speakers which would pipe in the courtroom proceedings. Charlie referred to this room as the Mouse House, and it was also the room where he and the girls would be taken if they started acting out in court, which they did a lot. So if they had to be removed from the court, they would go and sit in the Mouse House, as Charlie called it. Each morning while they were sitting there, Charlie would instruct the girls on what to do and say, telling them to respond when he did certain gestures. Now this the girls did, but it does seem like some of them started kind of questioning Charlie at this point. Perhaps a little bit too late, but it does seem that doubt started to seep in here. Here's a quote from Patricia Krenwinkel.
Each day was scripted by Manson. He'd tell us, okay, today you're going to stand up and hold your hand in some kind of symbol. And he'd tell us where to stand up and shout. He said everything we did was sending a picture out into the world that would somehow bend it to his will. At the ranch, Charlie was always saying he never lies. He was the truth. And now, every day he was asking us to lie, saying, tell them you did this and that. And I'd think, but I didn't do that. And it was like, you lie? A god lies?
Nonetheless, the 3 women obeyed Charlie's orders and even carved an X into their own heads. So did the family members who remained outside. The lawyer representing Susan Atkins, a man by the name of Fitzgerald, he overheard Charlie giving these orders to the girls, and he pleaded with him to stop. He felt that he could actually win the case using conventional methods. He felt that the jury would never buy the Helter Skelter motive. But soon after, Fitzgerald went home one night to find Lynette Squeaky Fromy waiting in his bed. She offered him a choice. Either jump in bed and have a good time with her right now and do whatever Charlie tells him, or else find another, less friendly family member waiting in his bed the next time. Pat, Leslie, and Susan would never speak to their attorneys privately. Manson was always in the room. So once again, we see, even during the trial, Manson is kind of the one orchestrating things. Attorneys are no. As for the rest of the family, they continued mostly to live at Spahn Ranch. They had been welcomed back, although not exactly with open arms, by George Spahn. And they weren't exactly welcomed back by the community either. Once people found out that this is where they were staying, there were some nighttime raids on Spahn Ranch. People would come driving in, throwing rocks, firing guns. Nobody was seriously hurt, but the family members felt it was only a matter of time. They did not have their cache of weapons that they had before because those had been confiscated in the Spahn Ranch and Barker raids, which took place the summer before. But they did have a few guns on hand, and they did have rocks, so they would throw rocks at the cars, trying to break the windows and scare people off, and it seems to have worked. The attacks eventually stopped. The family did start talking to the press, and a lot of the girls would be interviewed. They even allowed a film crew to come in to make a documentary, which would eventually be released under the title Manson. Squeaky would become kind of the unofficial press secretary of the family, making statements like this.
Love is infinite, and it's erratic, and it's crazy. Because in the soul, we are animals. And it don't take much, and we're right back to animals. and we're as ferocious as we need to be. Whatever we need to do, we do it, and it feels good. It feels good to be ready to face death and love it. And if someone needs to be killed, you do it. There is no wrong.
When asked if she really believed that Manson was God, she replied,
Yeah, Charlie is God, and that's why they're trying to kill him. The revolution is coming, and you'd better be ready. Once it starts, you'll hope to die quick. It'll be 1,000,000 times worse than Nazi Germany, and the establishment knows it's coming.
But Squeaky wasn't the only one talking to the press. When asked about Manson's chance during the trial, Mary Brunner had this to say.
Charlie will always be one. So even if they execute him, he's gotten where he's going. And if they set him free, he's won. So in a way, he's winning now.
Finally, it becomes Linda Kasabian's chance to testify. Now, Linda Kasabian was the former family member. She was relatively new to the group. She had stolen money from her ex-husband, $5,000, to give to the family to prove herself. And because she was the one with a valid driver's license that was still around, Mary Brunner had been arrested earlier in the day. She was the one who was chosen to be the driver on both nights of murder. She did, however, refuse Charles Manson's order to kill somebody, saying, "I'm not you, I can't kill." She had fled the family without her daughter and took off to New Hampshire, where she was living with her mother. But when she found out that police were looking for her after they learned her name from other family members, she turned herself in and cooperated with the prosecution, getting the immunity deal that we spoke of earlier. Now, she testifies and explains life in the family and the 2 nights of murders through quotes that you've heard on previous episodes. The defense immediately attacks her on cross-examination, and even before she even uttered a word, the defense team stands up and announces that they object to this witness because she is clearly insane due to too many acid trips. On cross-examination, they ask her embarrassing questions about her drug use and the sexual acts that she performed as part of the family in orgies. She admitted to these sex acts, although she said she never really took part in orgies, but she did have sexual encounters with 3 men, and she even admitted to enjoying it. The defense felt that this would show that she was kind of this, wanton woman out to do, countercultural things, whereas the prosecution said, you know what? Good. This shows that she's being honest because she's being open about her experience on the stand. So if she's not lying about this, why would she be lying about anything else? On August 3rd, American President Richard Nixon, much like another president we could name, loves to talk about the press and how poor they were at their jobs. During a speech in Denver, he used Manson as an example of this. Quote, "Charles Manson is in the front page of the papers every day. The case usually gets several minutes on the evening news. Here is a man who is guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders, without reason. As far as the press is concerned, he appears to be rather a glamorous figure. And the judge in this case is somehow the villain. The press set out to glorify and make heroes of those engaged in criminal activity. Haru." All right, he didn't say Haru, but, I'm a Futurama fan, so that goes in. Jurors had been sequestered, so they had no opportunity to hear reports of Nixon's remarks. And the family lawyers demanded a mistrial anyway, because if the jury did somehow learn of the president's remarks, it would surely affect their opinion of the case, so the lawyers said. The judge denied this request and instructed the bailiffs in charge of the jury to be even more cautious about making sure the jury was not exposed to any press regarding the trial. When court resumed after a midday release, Charlie rose, holding up a copy of the newspaper for the jury to see. The front page headline, in bold letters, declared, "Manson guilty, Nixon declares." The Manson girls rose and said in unison,
"Your Honor, the President has already said we are guilty, so why go on with the trial?"
The defense asked for another mistrial, but the judge refused, saying that the defendants had brought whatever ramifications may come from the jury seeing the headlines upon themselves. Linda continued to be questioned by the defense. As she answered, Pat, Leslie, and Susan yawned, giggled, or doodled on blank paper using colored pencils. Charlie continued his usual courtroom antics, such as yelling out, sometimes even at his own attorney. He would also refuse to stand or walk. Often the judge would have him removed and placed into the mouse house. When this happened, a bailiff would be required to stay in the room with him. The bailiff reported that as soon as it was just the two of them in the room, Charlie would immediately quiet down and stop his routines. He'd often brag about how perfectly the girls were following his instructions. For his part, Charlie said all of his actions were simply a form of protest. He claimed that he didn't like being the center of attention.
Everybody stops by my jail cell. Everybody wants to sneak a look and see if the man is there. There's a lot of sneaking going on, sneaking to get a look at the truth. The truth isn't in your courtroom. The truth is in the battlefields, your slaughterhouses. The truth is in the gas chamber. Anything you see in me is in you. If you want to see a vicious killer, that's who you'll see. If you want to see me as your brother, that's what I'll be. It all depends on how much love you have. I am you. And when you can admit that, you will be free. I'm just a mirror.
On August 13th, Linda finished her testimony and was officially granted a full pardon from the judge. Now free to do as she pleased, she returned to her mother's home in New Hampshire and began to raise her 2 children there. More witnesses are called, and at some point, Susan Atkins begins wailing and moaning, complaining of stomach pains. She is examined, and doctors diagnose her with an impacted colon. She is given laxatives and an enema and cleared to return to the courtroom. But she asked the judge for permission to leave again because she was still in so much pain. Despite her tears, her request was denied. Outside of the courthouse, the press asked prosecuting attorney Aaron Stovitz what he thought of Susan's distress. He offhandedly replied that it was a performance worthy of Sandra Bernhard. The next day, the DA's office announced that because he defied orders not to talk to the press, Aaron Stovitz was being removed from the case, and he would be replaced by the young deputy DA, Stephen Kay. When Stephen Kay came to the case, Bugliosi made it quite clear that he would be the lead prosecutor on this case, and Stephen Kay would be taking a back seat. The two men, although you might see interviews with them now, seem to get along, but according to Stephen Kay, the relationship actually wasn't that friendly. Stephen Kay says that Bugliosi was just overly ambitious, and it just was kind of off-putting to him. Barbara Hoyt was the teenaged former family member that came up briefly in the last episode. You'll remember that she said that she heard ranch hand Shorty Shea being murdered and had volunteered to cooperate with the police, saying that she had heard the girls also talking about the Tate and LaBianca's murders. Each day, Sandy and Squeaky would call her several times, asking her not to testify. They begged her to be a loyal friend to the family and not cooperate with the DA's office. On September 5th, they called to offer her a deal. If she would refuse to testify, they would treat her to a trip to Hawaii. Barbara accepted the offer, and the next day, she and good old Ruth Ann Morehouse flew to Honolulu. After a few days of bumming around the island, Ruth Ann announced that she had to return to L.A., but suggested that Barbara stay a few days more. Barbara went with Ruth Ann to the airport to say goodbye. Ruth Ann treated Barbara to a hamburger as they waited for her plane to begin boarding. When her flight was called, Barbara was finishing the last few bites of her burger, and Ruth Ann turned to her and said, "Just imagine if there were like 10 tabs of acid in that." And then she boarded her plane. Soon after, Barbara collapsed. Just before she lost consciousness, she pleaded with the crowd gathering around her, "Call Mr. Bugliosi." After being treated for an OD, Barbara survived, more determined than ever to testify against her former family. Family members Ruth Ann, Squeaky, Gypsy, Clem, and a new member named Dennis were all arraigned for attempted murder, but they would not be indicted and brought into jail until mid-December, and they remained free all that time. We'll have a little bit more to say about that later on. And it was also around early September that family members started hanging out outside the courthouse. Now, when I say courthouse, that makes it sound kind of quaint. It's actually a big, huge building, and this trial was taking place on the 3rd floor. But we're going to call it the courthouse, the halls of justice. The family members would sit out on the sidewalk. Once in a while, a male family member would be there. such as Clem or this new guy, Dennis, but for the most part, it was the female family members. Squeaky and Sandy were a near constant presence out there. And when they were out there, aside from the X marked on their foreheads, they really didn't seem all that menacing. They seemed to intentionally be very friendly, and they would play patty cake and sing songs, mostly Manson songs, and they would even stop and take pictures with tourists. They were not always so friendly to the prosecutors. Sandy and Squeaky would occasionally follow the prosecutors to their car and make thinly veiled threats, but the prosecutors tended to ignore them. Stephen Kay actually knew Sandy a little bit. As teens, they had been set up on a blind date. They had dinner at a pancake house, but it didn't lead to anything. Kay thought that Sandy was, quote, a little stuck-up snob. Later that September, Barbara Hoyt, now fully recovered from her overdose, is called to the witness stand and testifies about hearing the girls bragging about committing the murders, and she also testifies to the control that Charlie had over the family and the fact that he personally had ordered her to give strange men blowjobs. She said she didn't want to do it, but she was afraid of what Charlie would do to her if she refused. Juan Flynn testified next about Charlie telling him directly that he was the one doing all the killings. On October 5th, Detective Paul Whiteley takes the stand as a witness for the prosecution. The defense team declines the opportunity to cross-examine the witness, but as Whiteley is getting ready to leave the stand, Charlie stands and asks if he may question the witness. When the judge denies this request, Charlie says,
"You're trying to kill me, and I'm going to fight for my life one way or another. You should let me do it with words."
When the judge commands Charlie to sit down or he'll have him removed from the courtroom, Charlie replies,
"I'll have you removed. I have a little system."
When the judge ignores Charlie's outburst and continues talking to the witness, Charlie shouts,
"Do you think I'm kidding?"
He then jumps over the defense table and lunges at the judge, holding an upraised, sharpened pencil. Of course, he is tackled by the bailiffs before he can get too close to the judge and carried off to the mouse house. And as he's being dragged away, Charlie yells,
"In the name of Christian justice, someone should cut your head off."
And the girls take turns screaming things like,
This is a mockery of justice.
They're killing Christ! There is no justice!
More witnesses are called, including Terry Melcher, and former family members Brooks Poston and Little Paul Watkins, and their final witness, Diane Lake. Years later, Diane Snake Lake would recall talking to the press and meeting Manson one last time at the courthouse.
I just remember when they asked me, "Do you love him?" And I said, "I guess so." Charlie piped up and said, "Don't put it on Mr. Manson. She loved everyone."
On Monday, November 17th, the prosecution rested its case. Court took a break for a few days, and after the break, the trial resumed so the defense could present its case. To the surprise of many, the defense almost immediately announced that they too would rest their case. As soon as they said this, in a move orchestrated by Charlie, the girls jumped to their feet and demanded their right to testify at their own trial. The defense attorneys asked for a private meeting with the judge, and they approached the bench and explained to the judge that if the girls testified, they were surely going to act against their own best interest, take full credit for the murders, and insist that Charles Manson was innocent. Bugliosi agreed and wondered if Manson hadn't figured out a way to outmaneuver him after all. The judge rules that the defendants would be allowed to testify, but the jury would not be present. Then, after they had given their statements, the judge and the lawyers could determine which parts of their testimony would be admissible and have them read into the court record in the jury's presence. The girls objected, but Charlie was not shaken. He said that he would welcome the chance to testify with or without the jury present. This was Charlie's chance to give the speech of a lifetime to a crowded courtroom full of reporters. Whatever he said next would go out into the world. This was Charlie's moment to shine. He took the stand.
"These people you call my family, they are people you didn't want. Children that were along the side of the road that their parents had kicked out. So I took them to my garbage dump and fed them, and I taught them that in love there is no wrong. Everything they've done for love, brother. These children that come at you with knives, they're your children. You taught them. I didn't teach them. I just tried to help them stand up. I can't dislike you, but I will say this to you. You haven't got long before you are all going to kill yourselves because you are all crazy. And you can project it back at me, but I am only what lives inside each and every one of you. My father is the jailhouse. My father is your system. I'm a reflection of you, and I'm what you made me. I have done my best to get along in your world, and now you want to kill me. And I look at you, and I say to myself, you want to kill me? I'm already dead. Have been all my life. I've spent 23 years in tombs that you built. Sometimes I think about giving it back to you. Sometimes I think about just jumping on you and letting you shoot me. If I could, I would jerk this microphone off and beat your brains out with it, because that is what you deserve. That is what you deserve. Is it a conspiracy? Is it a conspiracy that the music is telling the youth to rise up against the establishment because the establishment is rapidly destroying things? Is that a conspiracy? The music speaks to you every day, but you are too deaf, dumb, and blind to even listen to the music. It is not my conspiracy. It is not my music. I hear what it relates. It says rise. It says kill. Why blame it on me? I didn't write the music. What about your children? You say there are just a few? Oh, there are many, many more, coming in the same direction. They are running in the streets, and they are coming right at you.
When he was done, he told the girls,
You don't have to testify now.
The judge called for a short break in the trial so both sides could prepare their closing arguments. On November 19th, Leslie's attorney, Ronald Hughes, told friends that he'd be going camping. When court resumed on November 30th, Hughes didn't show. Search teams and helicopters were dispatched to look for Hughes in the areas where he announced he would be camping, but his decomposing body was not discovered for another 6 weeks. The coroner ruled that his death was an accidental drowning, but speculation at the time and to this very day has run rampant that the family killed Hughes for constantly disagreeing with Charlie. So far, there is no proof to state that this is true. Leslie was appointed a new lawyer, and the trial resumed on December 21st. The prosecution and defense presented their closing arguments, and the judge gave the final instructions to the jury. They were asked to take their time and deliberate on the guilt or innocence of the defendants. 10 days later, they announced that they had a verdict. As Charlie and the girls were entered into the room, Charlie winked at them. The girls giggled and winked back. The four listened impassively as the jury foreman read the verdicts. All four defendants were found guilty on all counts. As they were led out of the courtroom, Charlie cried out to the jury, "You're all guilty." Then, of course, the trial would move into the penalty phase. So they've been found guilty. Now we've got to find out, are they going to get life in prison or the death penalty, which is what the prosecution was seeking. More witnesses are called. This time the defense calls many family members, and they take the stand to claim that Linda Kasabian had actually been the one to mastermind the murders because they claimed she was in love with Bobby and she wanted to get Bousselet out of jail by committing copycat murders that would look like the Hinman murders. Sandra Good would say as much in that documentary I mentioned earlier, Manson.
The only motives for the murders were love of brother. We would have done anything to get Bobby out of jail. It was simply Bobby had been arrested for the murder of Hinman, and the girls wanted to get him out of jail, so they committed these copycat killings, with the writing on the wall and the whole thing, multiple stab wounds, thereby leading the police to believe that the real killer was still at large. They asked Katie what she was thinking when she carved the word war on Lino LaBianca's chest. She said the only thing she was thinking was,
Here's one man who won't send his son to war.
These people more or less asked for it. Making movies like Rosemary's Baby, they were putting out pictures of murder.
Some even denied ever even hearing about Helter Skelter or anything about a race war. The jury was once again asked to deliberate and decide the fate of Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. When court resumed to hear their decision, as the clerk began to read it, Charlie jumped up, shouting,
"You people have no power over me. Half of you ain't even as good as I am."
He was sent back to the mouse house. Finally, the decision was read. All 4 defendants were sentenced to death in the gas chamber. As soon as it was announced, the girls rose, saying,
Helter Skelter's coming down fast!
Just judge yourself.
You'll all be judged in the end.
Manson, hearing all of this in the mouse house, made no comment. The jury was finally released, and all 4 defendants were sent off to death row to await their fate. And that is where we end today's episode. There will be one last final episode on the Manson case, talking about their life in prison and what these key players are up to now. And you will even hear from some of the cast members out of character to hear their thoughts on this case and their feelings as they were studying these people who they portrayed. So again, don't forget, I'm going to be running that contest on Instagram, so follow us there at SpookyAssShit and check out the website spookyasshit.com or spookyas.com, and you can find links to all of our social media there. You can also buy t-shirts. Please, if you are enjoying this series, let me know by writing a nice review on iTunes or whatever service you happen to be listening from. And until next time, don't be afraid.
Your perfection, for their love will surely be. No clothing, fear, or hunger. You can see, you can see, you can see.
Research for today's episode was primarily drawn from Jeff Guinn's book, Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson, and cielodrive.com. Today's episode featured the voice talents of
Mary Widow as Susan Atkins.
Lilith Beast as Patricia Krenwinkel.
Jackie Marchetti as Lynette Squeaky Fromy.
Tristan Sapersky as Mary Bruner.
Anna Massinger as Diane Lake.
Jackie Marchetti as Sandra Good.
Catherine DePola as Leslie Van Houten.
Quentin Capel as Charlie Manson.
and myself, Eric Dwinells, as Richard Nixon.